It's my great delight to have on the channel today a brand new friend. We don't go way back, but I've listened to several presentations of his, one of which I want you to hear. His name is Darrel Post. Daryl is a former teacher at Maranatha Baptist University some time ago and is going to tell us more about what he does. But what I wanted to bring him on the channel for was this presentation of his, Can We Know the Text? I heard a recording of this that he did, I believe, at his own local church, and it was just excellent. I'm basically always on the lookout for people who are able to introduce the topic of New Testament textual criticism in a faithful, inerrantist, conservative, evangelical way, but in a way that's as accessible as possible. There, in my estimation, are kind of two big groups out there, at least the ones that loom large in my mind. I'm kind of setting aside the secularists out there because they just don't loom large in my mind. But the textual absolutists, as we say in this channel, versus the textual confidence folks. That's me and my friends, and I think pretty much all of Orthodox evangelicalism, going back a long, long ways. But anyway, the absolutist side says that the whole question of New Testament textual criticism, how do we figure out which of the manuscripts and which of the readings in the manuscripts we should use for New Testament translations? They say it's easy, it's very simple. You choose the pure one and you reject the corrupted one. But if I were to hand one sheet of either of these to those individuals, in my experience, they could not tell me which one is the corrupt and which one is the pure. They can't tell by looking at the Greek what they're actually encountering. And so maybe, just maybe, these individuals should have the humility to sit and listen to those who believe that this subject is more complex. And yet the difficulty is, if it's so complex, how do you introduce it to non-specialists who can't read Greek? What exactly do you say? How do you guide them in a faithful and a biblical way, in a way that's also faithful to God's general revelation in history? That's what I think Darrel Post has done so well. Let me just real quick ask Daryl, before we jump into a lot of awesome material, and I'll be interacting a little bit with him as he goes throughout the presentation, but really it'll mainly be him. I want to just ask him, Daryl, what do you do to serve the body of Christ?
Well, thanks, Mark, for having me on. It's a great to be with you. I mean, my role is I'm very involved in my church. I teach the adult Sunday school class. I'm involved with this ministry here in Greek. There are some Greek students that I'm mentoring. So I do work a secular job to pay the bills, and but I am definitely involved in my local church and serving the body of Christ as a deacon and adult Sunday school, and I just love getting in the text and turning the text loose. And so that's my passion.
That's great. You taught, I just learned this as we got together here, you taught my friend, great friend, Paul Himes, whom I also interviewed on the channel recently, who, exceeds both of us clearly in his knowledge of New Testament textual criticism. I just love talking with Paul, and I thought that was a fantastic conversation. I really learned a lot from him on that. When did you teach Paul, and what did you teach Paul?
Well, I taught him second year Greek, and this would be, I want to say 1999, 2000, somewhere in there. And he was a great student. I tell you, nothing better as a teacher than to see one of your students excel and go beyond you and reach levels that you never reach yourself. And that's always a joy to see that happen.
Yeah, that's great
So,
humility. I definitely feel the same way. I love it when people send me false friends that I haven't seen in the King James Version. There's just a special kind of delight
sure.
when people do that for me. That's one of the main things I've been teaching. I think you understand. You've been watching the channel. You and my mother, thank you to both of you for watching the channel. Anyway, let's get right to your presentation. And I'm going to
Sure.
be the one advancing the slides. And, that causes a little awkwardness, everybody out there. That's just kind of the way it goes. But I really want Daryl to jump right in. And
Sure.
you said to start with slide 12, Daryl. So those of you who
Sure.
want the full slide presentation, you're going to have to find it
Sure.
another way. We'll put a link up to any materials that Daryl wants to share in the
Sure.
YouTube description thing, and you'll be able to get this presentation, I assume. But Daryl, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, basically, I'm in John chapter 11, and so this is a chapter I've become very acquainted with and very passionate about this chapter. You don't normally think of John 11 when you're discussing the text of the New Testament. I mean, when you think of texts that have issues, texts that have come under question, you think of the pericope adultery, you think of the ending of Mark. No one comes to John 11 and says this is an area where there's all kinds of questions until recently. Because recently what's happened is we had, of course, Bart Ehrman publishing Misquoting Jesus, 2005. We've had kind of a shift of worldview among scholars who don't necessarily believe in inspiration, much less inerrancy. But they, 20 years ago, there was still an expectation. We can reconstruct the text. We can discover what the original autographs would have looked like, and that amongst many in the secular scholarship world is gone. They no longer view it that way. And so many now look at it as the text is like chaotic during the first 200 years of church history, so chaotic, so many mistakes, so many problems. There's no way we can really understand what the originals would have looked like. That's kind of becoming a consensus on the skeptical side, the extreme skepticism that you like to talk about in your podcast. So John 11 actually came under an attack in 2016. There was a Duke University PhD student who published in a Princeton Theological Review periodical a question about John 11, suggesting that Martha was added to the text of John 11 in the second century. They basically rewrote the chapter. So that's where I got started with John 11. And the more I got into this, the more I realized, this is a chapter that really I think can be analyzed and studied. And so what I've been doing is I have been studying manuscripts and collating manuscripts of John 11 since 2019, and I've now reached 1,390 manuscripts that I've personally checked every word against the base text, and I've documented all the differences. So I have real data here that I've dug into deeply. And I'm far enough along, I've done about 75% of all continuous text manuscripts I have now collated. And I don't expect to find much new or much different. So I think my data is pretty solid at this point. It's not going to change.
Continuous text manuscripts are those, unlike lectionaries,
Right.
like your daily devotional, which might have a little excerpt from many passages, all scattered around. Continuous text means basically it probably originally had the full text of John, right?
Right. The verses go continuously throughout the book. There's no interruptions. Now, there's also commentary manuscripts where they would have a katina, which is commentary notes wrapped around the scripture text, but the scripture text is still continuous text. And so lots of different kinds of manuscripts. But yeah, the lectionaries are a different ballgame. I've collated now 52 lectionaries, so I've got that flavor in my work as well. Of course, I've checked all the papyri, the majuscules, all the ones that have part of John 11. I've included those as well in my study. So
papyri is very, very old manuscripts, like the very first one in the presentation on this title page, and you can see the fibers of that papyrus. That was the paper, basically, that's where you get the word paper, that was used in the most ancient times. And then majuscules are written in all capitals, unlike this manuscript, for example, where even if you don't read Greek, you might be able to kind of tell they're not all written in all caps, or are they? I'm looking at this. It's just a little. You should tell. You're a little more into this stuff, majuscules and minuscules.
Sure.
What's the difference between the two?
Well, when you get back to the papyri, there's a mixture of lettering. But when you get to the great uncials like Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Bezae, Codex Vaticanus, these are all in strict capital letters. And so those are very difficult to copy, and they're very difficult to read because it's just hard because you get these large square letters. It's not like having a cursive script. And so the minuscules, that's the lowercase cursive script that we see take hold around the 9th century and all the way through to the Reformation and the inventing of the printing press. So that's kind of a nutshell on this.
I really am wanting this to be able to be entered into by people with very little background. That's
Sure.
just difficult. It is complex.
It is.
But I'm going to stop you, Daryl, and have you define some
Sure.
terms for that reason. But I don't want to stop you too
Sure.
much. Let's get back into your presentation.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm
So
on
that,
slide 12 here.
awesome. So with that background, so John 11 has come under an attack. And there's also, the Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, his approach is to basically say that in any given portion of the New Testament, there are more variations in the wording among all the manuscripts than there are actual words in a particular section. So in John chapter 11, there are 945 words in the Nestle Aland Greek text of John chapter 11. And so the approach that Bart Ehrman says is, how can you know what the original John 11 would look like when there's more variations than there are even words, 945? And so the question then is, how many variations did I find in my research? How many were there compared to these 945 words? And again, I've checked 1,390 manuscripts. So advancing the slide, this is kind of a shock. And when I present this to students, there's an initial reaction that's like, wow, I had no idea. There's only 945 words, and you're telling me there's 3,785 variations on those 945 words. That's troubling. And that's the point. That's why this argument from the extreme skeptical side has such force, because this is truth. I mean, this is a fact that I found. I found this many variations on these 945 words. The
And the
problem,
textual
yeah,
absolutist side, Daryl, right? That's why this is their view is so appealing to them. They don't even have to think about all those
oh,
variations
right,
because they can just pick
right,
one and say this is the one.
right. Right. Yeah, and right. And the problem with that is which one? Which one do you pick? Because
Right.
every manuscript of any length is going to have at least some nonsense readings and other variations. And I'll talk about those in just a minute. And so yeah, so this is shocking to the students. In fact, last time I taught this, I had some eyes wide open, and the students were like, "Really? Are you really saying it's this bad?" Well, so then what I do in my presentation, we're going to step through this number. What does this 3,785 actually mean? And so that's where we actually get into the nitty gritty. And I'm going to try to, group this and simplify as best I can. I don't want to get lost in the weeds because I think there's an important message here from John 11, and it's not Lazarus coming out of the tomb, although that is an important message. First of all, we have what's called nonsense readings. Now, nonsense readings sometimes are comical. I always enjoy finding a good nonsense reading. These are obvious errors. Scribes are human. To err is human, and every manuscript is going to have at least one or two nonsense readings. They were never the intent of the scribe making the copy, but there's mental strain, there's fatigue, there's inattention, and so errors are going to creep into the text. They're unintentional. So let me just give you some examples from John 11, going on to the next slide. One kind of caught me funny here. There's one spelled Lazarus, just Zaurus, just forgot to pen the lambda alpha and just left us with Zaurus. Sometimes they'll just write the same letter twice. This can especially happen if they're at the end of a line. You understand, they're copying manually, and the scribe will get to the end of a line. They'll start a word, and then maybe they'll take a break, and they come back, and they go to the next line, and they'll just start the word over again. But that's a variation. It's a spelling mistake. Sometimes they had decorative letters. They would get into the margin. They'd stop and put in a special decorative letter just to make it look fancy. And those decorative letters could sometimes be in the middle of a word, not even the beginning. And so that sometimes they would purposely not write a letter, planning later to go back and write that decorative letter and then forget to do it. And so you end up with, in one text, I found May instead of Mary because the row was left out because it was intended to be a decorative letter. Sometimes they'll just repeat the same clause. That happens a lot. We call this ditography, just writing the same thing accidentally twice. Moving on to the next slide. This one was funny. One scribe wrote Ma Maria instead of Maria.
That's great.
So these are just nonsense readings. They can show up in any manuscript, especially on the turn of a page. You'll see that happen a lot. An entire verse can get left out at times, but these are obvious mistakes. Now, going on to the next slide, this is an important one here. This happens a lot. You have to visualize a scribe sitting there making this copy for hours on end. And in this example here, John 11:24, notice what the text says. Mary said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection in the last day. So if you're a scribe, you've got in this hand here, you've got your exemplar. This is what you're copying from. And the scribe reads in the, and so they write down in the. But when they go back, they don't go back to the right in the. They go back to the in the before last day, and they write last day, and they've just left out in the resurrection. Totally. Very easy. This is very common whenever you have similar clauses. And so this actually happens at 51 out of the 1,390 manuscripts I have checked, and 8 of these were later corrected. And so sometimes they catch it and they fix it. So no textual critic is going to argue for nonsense readings being original. So we can take these out. So coming back to the next slide, coming back to our 3,785, we're going to take out our nonsense readings. So we move on to the next slide, and look what happens. 950 nonsense readings are gone. Now our number is down to 2,835. Now that's still a lot of variations for only 945 words. So no one gets any comfort yet from this number.
Yeah.
When I'm presenting this.
Okay.
So
well, we need comfort, so let's keep going.
Well, let's keep going. We need some comfort here. So we go on to minor variations of spelling in the next slide. Now this is a very common thing. English is just like Greek in that there are words that have all different kinds of spelling. I mean, we have burnt and we have burned. You can write either one of those and get a passing grade. You're not going to get those marked off. Axe can have an E and axe cannot have an E, and either one is correct. Greek does the same thing. There are words that just have different spelling variations. Some of them I've seen it. They go in and out of style throughout some of the centuries. Some of the early words have different spellings, and then the style changes. And it doesn't affect anything. These are not impacting our ability to understand the text as John composed it under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So these can be set aside. Going on to the next slide, here's some examples. We have like Bithany instead of Bethany. The name Maria or Miriam or Marian is variously spelled among the manuscripts, but it's all the same person. Place names are notorious for differences. Ephraim can be spelled Ephraim in some of the manuscripts. It has no impact on understanding of the text at all. And then if we go on, we also have abbreviations. And this was a very common practice that started very early. In fact, it's called, in textual critics call it nomina sacra or nomen sacrum. And these are very common. They revered the name of Christ. They revered God's name. And so rather than spelling out theos, they would just provide the initial theta, the final sigma, and put a line over the top to indicate this is theos. But it's an abbreviation. I've given an example here of Jesus, just the initial iota, the final sigma, put a line over it, and that's how you'll see it in the text. In fact, one of the ways that researchers will identify Christian manuscripts and scripture manuscripts is by looking for nomina sacra. If they see a nomina sacra, they know it's a Christian text as opposed to something secular.
Right.
And so this started very early. So going on to the next slide, then, we also have issues where there's a different form of the same word. Greek is a highly inflected language. Those of you who are linguists understand what I mean. You have a root word. You can put prefixes and suffixes around that root word to change the number, the gender, and all these different aspects of the word. And so with Greek, very commonly, a scribe will accidentally write the wrong form. It's like writing this instead of these in English, or walked instead of walking. The good news is most of the time the context will tell you which one was the intended by the author and which one was erroneous, because you'll read it and it doesn't make any sense. It's almost a nonsense reading. I don't qualify these as nonsense readings because they're legitimate words. It's just the wrong form of the word. So these are common. Going on to the next slide, again, the context and flow is going to make these clear in almost every instance. So we can set these aside as variations. But before we do that, one more quick category. Next slide. We have what are called confusing vowel sounds. This is very similar to English. We have, in fact, I love this one. The first one on the list here, we have so, and so. S-O means therefore. So, S-E-W means stitching something, and S-O-W is putting seeds in the ground. All three sound exactly the same. So imagine you're in a scriptorium, in the ancient days, in like the 4th century, you're in a scriptorium and you're making a copy and someone is just reading the text and you get a word like this. You hear so. Well, do you write down S-O, S-E-W, or S-O-W? You have to know the context and be paying attention to know which it is. So these have crept into the Greek text. They're all over the place. It doesn't take very long a reading in the Greek to identify these. And again, the good news is most often we know which one was original and which one was the mistake. And so, the scribes sometimes are going to have the word in their mind. They read it, they got to trap it in their mind for 3 seconds until they get more ink out of their inkwell, and then pen that on the new manuscript, and they'll transpose the letters. What should have been epsilon iota becomes an eta because they both have the A sound. The diphthong epsilon iota and the standalone letter eta, same exact sound. And they'll just transpose it because in that 2 seconds from their mind to the pen, they've switched the letters and they made a mistake. Going on to the next slide, again, most of these issues, the scholars have no problem identifying these kinds of mistakes. They're easily identified and they know which ones were the original. Now, sometimes, I will say, sometimes there are different forms that are legitimately different words or different parsings of different words. And so there is a little bit of debate on some of these.
And let me stop you for 1 second, Daryl. I'm just going to draw on another example I've heard before, just to show I'm tracking with you and try to make sure everybody else is tracking with you. I think it was Dan Wallace who uses this example. You know, if you read a copy of the Constitution and it said "We the people," in order to form a more perfect onion, you would just
Yeah,
know immediately.
yeah,
Okay, this is
yeah,
just a slip of the pen. You know, you accidentally connected the top of the U and it looks like an O.
yeah,
It's one thing to hear, oh, there's a corrupted copy of the Constitution. It's another thing to hear, oh, well, actually, if you just take one look at the portion
right,
that's supposedly corrupted, you can tell obviously what was intended. I think it's
yeah,
so helpful what you're doing. When we get to a wrap up, I'm going to describe the way I think it's so helpful, but I just want to keep going. Let people follow your logic. And I
sure.
can't wait to see the next chart. So let's go back to that.
Okay. Yeah, we need some more. Yeah, we need some more hope here that this number is going to shrink. So going on to the next slide, then these there's also corrected mistakes, and this is a category it's hard to kind of analyze it because sometimes the scribe is going to make a mistake and immediately they go, oh, I blew it. They know they made a mistake, and so what they're going to do is they're going to scratch away what they wrote. On parchment, it's very difficult because it's sheepskin, and when you scratch that away, it kind of damages the sheepskin a little bit. It leaves like a rough mark, and so that's why we usually can know that something was there. And then the ink written on top of that rough mark is a little bit darker ink, so we know every time that happens. And when that happens, that's actually a variation. Even though the scribe may have correctly corrected it, sometimes they can actually correct something that was right and make a mistake. It can go either way. But we know there was something written that's now scratched away. So these are variations. I have to count them in the number, but they're corrected. And so let's go back to our next chart here. We were left off here with 2,835, still a very large number. So what are we taking out? We are taking out these corrected mistakes. We're
Wow.
taking out the confusing vowel sounds. We're taking out all these things. So now watch what happens. The yellow bar is going to grow, and this orange bar is going to shrink when we advance the slide. So let's advance the slide. Notice now we've only got 1,258 left after taking out all those spelling variations, abbreviations, confusing vowel sounds, all that stuff that we don't have to worry about. We're getting closer. Now, we still have more variations than we have actual words in John chapter 11, but we're getting closer. So let's press on. Next slide. This one's a fun one. Singular readings. Now, what's a singular reading? A singular reading just simply means there's only one manuscript that has an addition, an omission, or a substitution of word or words in the text. And so, for instance, John 11:32, it says, then when Mary came to the place where Jesus was, there's only one Greek manuscript that includes this additional word, the place. And you can see why somebody would add it, because it seems to be part of the natural flow of this verse. But no textual critic is going to argue that we should add the place here to this verse because it's only supported by one manuscript. It's singular. Now, the next slide, the singular readings are different from nonsense readings in that they do make sense. They're logical. They fit the context. It's just that they only appear in one manuscript, so it's a mistake. Yeah, here's another one, John 11:51. This is Caiaphas. It says, now this he, Caiaphas, did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year. Well, there's one manuscript that reads being ruler that year. And so you can understand why a scribe would just have the wrong word pop into his mind. Maybe he's rushing, he's trying to copy too much at once instead of going back and looking at his exemplar, and he just, oh yeah, that guy was a ruler. He just writes in ruler instead of high priest. So there are a lot of singular readings, and it's very logical why they would creep into the text. So between nonsense readings and singular readings, there's quite a few. So let's take a look at what this can do for us. So next slide, you see this is where we left off. Okay,
Yeah.
1,258 variations in John 11 against 945 words. So let's advance to the next slide and see what this does for us.
Wow.
Now we're down to only 402. So now we have fewer variations than actual words in John chapter 11 by quite a bit now. But 402 is still quite a bit. As I've taught this many times now, the students in the classroom, they don't get satisfied with 402. They're a little bit relieved, but it's kind of like,
Yeah.
that's still a lot.
Right.
Let's be honest about this. This is not a good number to be content with. Well, the next one is sort order. Advancing the slide here again. So sometimes the scribes are just going to write the words in a different order. And there's a variety of methodological reasons why they might do that as they're copying. Sometimes ideas can easily get transposed in your mind as you're moving from exemplar to the new copy. So in these situations, though, the actual words are not in dispute. That's important. Only the order in which these words appear. And this has no impact whatsoever on translation work. None. And so these are things we can easily set aside. Let's look at an example on the next slide here. We have John 11:44. I love this one. It says, and he who had died, that's Lazarus, came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes. Now you can go to Bible Gateway and search for this verse and click on all translations. Every last English translation is going to say hand and foot. But the Greek actually says foot and hand. It's a cultural thing. We don't typically think of putting our feet before our hands.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a natural thing. It's a hand and foot. And so all English translations are going to read that. Now, apparently, there were some Greek scribes who thought like we do, because 273 of the manuscripts actually do read hand before foot. But the original was no doubt foot and hand. It's just very late manuscripts that flip that around.
This is really, really great. Let me just stop and make an observation here. I was just listening to the Fundamental Baptist podcast. Hyles Anderson graduate David Baker and I did a video critiquing a video of his, and I didn't say only negative things. I said there was one big section that I was really positive about. He's got some gifts there. Anyway, though, in the intro to that podcast, they played that famous sermon, and I really should know this. I want to say it was Curtis Hudson, like right before he died of cancer. Things that are different are not the same. And then I want to say Bill Grady picked up that line and made a book out of it. That's the portion of the King James only movement that I just haven't paid as much attention to because I can't get any serious, engagement or serious, arguments out of them. But that makes a lot of sense to the person who's never translated anything. Well, things that are different are not the same. If this is going to be a divine text, it's got to be perfect, and everything matters. Even word order matters. And well, yeah, there are certainly places where word order matters.
Sure.
But this is a great example where are you really going to say that there's a big difference? It really matters, foot and hand versus hand and foot. And you can say, well, it does matter because the Spirit inspired something, and we need to find out what that was. And sure, we agree with that. We're going to try to find that out too, but we don't have the Spirit telling us which one is accurate.
Right.
We have to use some method, and that's what everybody who does any kind of textual criticism or actually translation ultimately has to do. Okay, continue. This is just awesome. I love this.
Sure. Well, and just let me add to what you said there, Mark. It's also important to point out, I'm going to say several times, well, this doesn't matter for translation, or this is instant. Well, don't make any mistake about this. The scholars who do this work, they will chase down and research every nuance, every little, jot and tittle, I can say, to try to ascertain which is original. So just because it doesn't impact translation, it doesn't mean that I'm saying that, that it's not important. It is, because these scholars are going to pour all the same effort into finding out which one was original, even on these things that seem insignificant. So, incredible work has been done and continues to be done to get us close to that original in the Greek, as we can. So the hand and foot, this is a great example. So sort orders, we're going to knock these out because, again, doesn't impact our translation work. So coming back then on our next slide to the chart, we have 402. I think I found 70 some examples. Now, sometimes these categories overlap. Like there's sort order issues that are also singular readings. I've already knocked those out of singular readings. So sometimes these overlap.
Okay.
But this one, I found 70 some. So click to the next slide, and we have now just 327 to deal with. So what's left? Next slide. Remaining 327 variations. These are all going to be represented in these three kinds that are left. There's omissions, that's words left out. There's additions, that's words that are added, and then we have substituted words. That's just simply changes in the wording. Now, the good news is most of these are either easy to resolve or they have only minimal impact on the meaning of the text, just nuance stuff, and we'll talk about this. So let's dive into this. We have omissions. Next slide. I found 175 examples in John 11 where some manuscripts lack a word or words that were part of the original text of John 11. And again, only a few of these prove hard to resolve, and none impact our understanding of the text. That's great news. Now, why would a scribe omit words? Well, there's all kinds of examples I could show in this presentation, but if you go to the next slide, there's conjunctions. Conjunctions are wonderful little connective words. They are important. If you're into Greek, you can get some of these books on discourse analysis where they will analyze words like and but and then. And sometimes they can become very significant in the logic and the structure of an argument. But these words, when they're copied, the scribe tends to read the story, and they get the story in their mind, and they go to write, and they just forget to put in this little connective. It just gets frequently dropped out among some manuscripts, enough that I can't call these singular readings. But the manuscripts that typically drop these, it's accidental. I think it's just because their minds are into the story. And it's always a bad thing if you're a copyist. You don't want to think about the story. In fact, Mark, I've seen it where uh, there was one I was doing years ago. I was collating a manuscript, and it got to the Passion Week and the crucifixion. And this scribe he had done tremendous work. And then all of a sudden, he's making mistakes left and right. He can't get anything right. He's spelling words wrong. He's leaving words out. And it dawned on me, he's into the story.
That's great.
He's not paying attention to his work. So these things happen, especially with conjunctions. So we don't really worry about these so much. It doesn't really impact the meaning of the text directly. And most of these are easy to resolve. It's just usually like 10, 15, 20 manuscripts at most that leave these out. I can't call them singular, but they're almost
Yeah.
like singular readings.
Let me jump in here. And of course, these words, omissions and additions and, deletions, or actually, and I'm forgetting what the third word was that you used. I'm going to go back. Substituted
Substitution.
words.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, substitutions. These are pretty loaded. And anytime anybody hears, oh, words are omitted, oh, words were added, well, Revelation 21 says the curse will be added
Right.
to the person who adds or omits.
Right.
And I want everybody to understand what you're saying here. I'm going to try to repeat it, and you make sure that I'm understanding you correctly. The reason you're willing to call it an omission is that even though the lack of this word, for example, and or but, a
Sure.
conjunction, it it most of the manuscripts that you look at, the ones that seem trustworthy, the ones that are older, or just the vast majority of them, they would
Sure.
have this word
Right.
and or but at this
Right.
place.
Yes.
But just a few, enough so that it's not a singular reading,
Right.
lack them. And so it's rather clear that
Right.
these words, were omitted from these few manuscripts. Same, I'm going to assume, with additions. You've got such an
Yes.
overwhelming, testimony and all the rest of the manuscripts to the presence
Right.
of these, maybe even across manuscript families, that you're
Oh, sure.
safe calling them additions. So we're kind of talking about the obvious minority readings,
Right.
and I'm gathering that internal testimony
Yes.
suggests that they should be there because they make perfect sense where they are, and that's why you feel confident. Rather than saying, as the Lexham Textual Notes does, and this is one reason I recommend it. It doesn't use the words omit or add or substitute.
Sure.
It uses the words present or absent.
Right.
So that there's no
Not as loaded.
prejudicing of
Sure.
the discussion. I just wanted to get that in there. Just want to make sure I'm saying that
Yes.
right.
Yes. Absolutely. And another way to put it, Mark, is to say on most of these, the majority text, the Textus Receptus, and the critical text all agree. Yes, it's not. There's no debate even among these. Sometimes they're viewed as very disparate,
Yeah.
printed editions. The reality is they agree largely. It's everyone. Everybody gets worked up about the differences, but the reality is they largely agree on things like this, especially.
Right.
And so, yeah.
I have
Now,
one other little point to make here,
sure.
Daryl. I'm really, really sorry. As I turned my head to look, I noticed there is glitter on my face. And if I don't say something about it, I will get comments from nasty people. My grandmother sent my annual package, we're recording this, right before Christmas, of Christmas
Right.
cookies that she's done for decade upon decade. And she tied it
I love
together
it.
with this bow that was full of glitter. And
Yeah.
apparently it got all over me. And I tried to get it off, but only in the bright light that I've got here in the studio did I see, yep, sure enough, it's like right here. So I just want to
Oh,
tell all my viewers out there, normally glitter does not appear in New Testament textual criticism videos.
no.
I'm sorry. I've been very, very busy today, racing back and forth between Bellingham and Mount Vernon, taking my daughter with me to work, taking her to the dentist, taking her to her first flute lessons. There's my excuse. Okay, please, please
Okay.
continue.
Well, we'll forgive Grandma for glitter bombing you. So that's
Yeah.
that's great. So, okay, on the next slide then. This is another one. This is one of my favorites. Definite article. The. I mean, a word like the, you wouldn't think it would be much of an issue, but in Greek, this definite article is used all over the place. We don't use it as much in English as it's used in Greek. In fact, Proper names typically get the definite article. So no English translation is ever going to say the Peter answered and said to the Jesus. It's just never going to be translated that way. That's not good English, but it's there in the Greek. So sometimes these articles, they get added or they get dropped, and sometimes it's debated. We don't know which one it is, but it really has no impact on the meaning. It's not going to be translated anyway, and so these are ones I think we can safely set aside. Um, so again, John 11:30 here, it says, now the Jesus had not yet come into the town. Well, 11 manuscripts omit the. 11, it's not, like I said, it's almost a singular reading, but it's not, because it is 11 manuscripts, but no one would argue that that should be omitted, even though we're not going to translate it. It's not going to be part of the English translation, so we just don't have to worry about that one. All right, so the next slide, we have extraneous words. John 11:44, Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. See, in Greek, you don't, trying to explain this to English readers, you don't need a second preposition here in Greek. In Greek, you can just say loose him and let go. And Greek is perfectly fine with it. In English, we have to have a second pronoun for this to be good English. But what's happened here is the originals actually, in fact, this is one where it's a very small minority. Can I say, Alexandrian manuscripts, if that means something to people? It's a very small minority that actually include this pronoun here, the second pronoun. The vast majority, it dropped out early. The vast majority do not have this pronoun, but it's going to be translated regardless, either way. Whether you have this or not, it's going to be part of your English translation. And so this is not really an issue that's going to impact our understanding of the text. And so I think this is one we can safely set aside. So that's kind of an example of some of the omissions. Now, moving on, next slide, on to additions. Manuscripts tend to grow. Greek is a very elastic language, and it loves to throw in extraneous words. So you can have a verb like answered, and answered can stand all alone by itself. It doesn't even need to have a subject, because the subject can be built into the parsing of that verb. So you can have answered. What's going to happen? Somebody's going to come along, a scribe is going to add a subject to that verb. They're just going to add he, because that's what they're thinking. In the context, they know it's he answered from the context, so they just add he as they're copying. Well, somebody else might come along and say, well, I know it's Peter who's answering, so they swap out he for Peter. Well, then somebody else can come along and say, well, Peter answered, but he's going to speak. So they add Peter answered and he said, and then you can add a saying. Yes, these things can just grow with time, and they do. So again, but even with this example, nothing that's been added has destroyed our ability to understand what John said. Whether you include all these words or only go with answered, the context is clear, and you're not losing understanding at all.
I love this. I love this. And I want to break in. I want to say that in a language in which the written language did not originally include all the varied developed punctuation that we now use in written formal English, and so things like the word saying could function effectively like quotation marks. I'm about to tell you, I'm about to start. The words are actually coming from the person that I'm quoting. And that's why words like that could also be included. Anyway, yes, this is so great. Keep going.
Okay. So more with additions here. I actually found 87 examples in John 11 where multiple manuscripts have added a word or words that are not accepted as part of the original text of John's gospel. And again, most of these are where Textus Receptus, critical text, majority text all agree. Okay, so these are things that are just extraneous out there that are part of the variation collection. And so again, why would a copyist add words to the text? That always sounds scary. People say, well, adding to the text. So you mentioned Revelation and the warning by adding to the text. Well, these aren't, malicious copyists. They're not doing this because they're trying to make a statement. Copyists tend to be very careful with the text. But you have to understand, if you're spending a year making a manuscript, you're going to make mistakes. So I found, several examples here. In fact, even the secular scholars will say, yeah, there's a few examples that maybe were done for theological reasons, but I believe all of these additions in John 11 were just accidental. So let's just kind of look at some of these. There's situations where words are added because they just seem to naturally follow. And, they're putting the ink back in the inkwell, and their mind is stale for a second, and they're thinking about the story, and it's easy to add additional words. Sometimes they'll add things in that were in the margin of their exemplar. Somebody made a note in the exemplar saying, "Oh, I think this is this," and so the copyist will see that in the margin, and they'll just add that right into the new copy, and it makes it look like it's part of the original scripture text. So that's kind of dangerous. That can happen as well. On to the next slide. This is a classic example of an addition from John 11. It's John 11:41. The text there says, "And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me." So notice the pronoun his is in italics. That's because if you have some English translations, and King James does this, if there's a English word that has no Greek word, it's just been supplied for good English, they put it in italics to signal to you this is not in the original Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the case here. The original copy of John 11 did not have his, because if you think about it, if you're lifting up eyes, who else's eyes can you lift up other
Yeah.
than your own, right? So you just lift up eyes, okay? And so 123 manuscripts actually added his to the text. And we can understand why, because it just naturally follows. Now, where did Jesus lift his eyes? Well, the text doesn't say, but 173 manuscripts added unto heaven, because Jesus goes on to address the Father. So you can just see how these things will grow. And if you go to the next slide, there's actually 31 manuscripts that added both his to eyes as well as unto heaven. So these things just kind of grow. But has anything been lost? No, because even with these additions, these are things that are logical from the context. We know that this is true because of the context. We don't need these words, but it's not changed John's meaning at all, so we don't have to worry about these. And then one more on the next slide.
Okay,
I'm
let's
sorry,
keep
go ahead.
going. Well,
Okay.
I jumped in, so I will.
Sure.
I'll keep going with my interruption here.
Sure.
I just love this. This is absolutely fantastic, and I can't wait to see the next chart. I think what's hitting me here is when I look at these differences. It's scary to think. There are different New Testament manuscripts. They don't all say the same thing. But what you're doing is patiently showing us over and over again how differences in wording don't necessarily have to make any difference in meaning. Just wanted to say that. Let's keep going.
Yep. Yeah, and we're going to stress this again, that we're talking about the difference between a nuance and the difference in an understanding. When you can't understand something, that's serious. That's very serious if you can't understand. But if we're just talking about nuance differences, Jesus instead of Christ, or some of these additions that are just adding what we already know to be true, these aren't concerning to us. And so, so here's another example. There's only 5 manuscripts that add a word here to John 11:43. Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. Well, you can see why some would just add the word saying, because it's a quote now, and they're just into the story. So Jesus is speaking. This is the climax of the whole chapter, of the whole account. Lazarus, come forth. And so they just add that word saying. Only 5 manuscripts. So no one's going to argue that saying there is legitimate. It's just that it is there in 5 manuscripts. Okay, so with additions then, it is important to point out, and Mark, you alluded to this earlier, this debate between is something added, was it dropped out, which is original. So there are some examples, to be totally transparent. In the New Testament, there are examples that are debated. Was it dropped and it shouldn't have been? Was it added and it shouldn't have been? It's debated. Now, in John 11, I did not find any that were hard to resolve in this sense, that were, affects the nuance even and are hard to resolve. There aren't any of those in John 11, so that's good news. So then moving on, then I found, next slide, substituted words. I found 65 examples in John 11 where some manuscripts display a completely different word in place of the word that's found in other manuscripts. And a couple of these do affect the specific nuance, but again, none affect our ability to understand what the Apostle John was trying to tell us about the story. And so the vast majority of these are easily explained by the scholars who are doing this work on the original text. So next slide, an example here, John 11:4. You have, when Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Well, there's 6 late manuscripts that switch that title to Son of Man. clearly a mistake. No one's going to argue. All of the printed Greek texts are going to say Son of God. That's the original, but there are 6 that change it to Son of Man. And we're going to see this whenever there's a title like this that's common, and there's different places in the New Testament they have a similar title. Somebody's going to make that mistake. It's just always going to happen. In this case, it was 6. See, and part of the problem here, Mark, I should also point out, is the fact that there are so many manuscripts. Okay, we wouldn't even be having much of this
Right.
discussion if all we had were 11 manuscripts or 100 manuscripts of John's Gospel, because most of this chaff that we're wiping away wouldn't even exist. So part of the problem, the skeptics have all this fuel to argue about, but the problem is, if we didn't have we want the manuscripts. I mean, this is great to have so many manuscripts, but with
Right.
the manuscripts come all these additional readings
Minor
that we have to
variations,
kind of
right.
sift through.
Yeah, and another little
So,
point here, if you have a textual absolutist view where you already know what the perfect one is, it's the Textus Receptus, for example, then you don't have to
mhm,
do any of this kind of work. And that's
right,
why
right,
I effectively never, I would just say never, hear my brothers
mhm,
and the King James and TR, defending worlds talk at this
mhm,
level of detail. They don't have to. They can skip right over it.
right,
They can, hop in
right,
their jet and go past flyover country because they
right,
have what's perfect. But where the debate
right,
has gone with defenders of the TR
mhm,
in all its branches, and
mhm.
those who follow my channel know what I'm talking about, is that they haven't been able to answer the question, okay, well, which TR is the
Which
perfect
TR? Yeah,
one?
right,
And and so unless you somehow, baptize this one, and then you have to explain, well, why that one and not others.
right, right.
I've gotten a fair number of my opponents, frankly, in this debate to give some level of acknowledgement. Okay, well, we can't exactly pick one perfect TR. It's the family of TR manuscripts, um,
Right, right,
or it's or they just don't address the question whatsoever. If
right,
in either case, they're still having to do this kind of work, maybe less of it, but they're still
right,
having to do it. So unless you can have an absolutist perspective, and wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great if we
yeah,
all go on to other things? If your mind is
right,
kind of, your eyes are glazing over and you're like, wow, this is just so much detail. Well, then this is
sure,
not your calling and you're going to have to trust somebody else to
right,
do this kind of work. But this is the
right,
situation, as I frequently say, this is the situation that God gave us.
yeah.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah, it's God's providence. We're here because of God's providence. This is what we
Right.
have, and so we wrestle with it. And so, yeah. So substituted words. On the next slide here, we've got pronouns. And I think I've alluded to this already, where pronouns can get swapped out for the proper name. Here's an example: John 11:53, where there's 3 late manuscripts that swap out the pronoun and say they plotted to put Jesus to death instead of just putting him to death. Well, again, it doesn't really matter. We know what they're talking about. It's a very minor variation that's not debated. Next slide. This is a good one here. John 11:55, because sometimes scribes will copy, they'll replace a word with another term that basically means the same thing. So John 11:55, it says, "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves." So you have Passover mentioned twice in the verse. 33 manuscripts swap out feast for the second mention of Passover. Well, Passover is a feast, and we know from the context that it's the Passover feast. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, these 33, the meeting's not altered. We don't have to worry about this one. So I'm just trying to illustrate that the vast
Right.
majority of these issues are just like this. We don't have to worry about them, and they're not even debated among the 3 different printed Greek texts. So it's not an issue. Next slide, I'll just quickly go through this one. Pronoun or prepositions. Prepositions are very flexible. You understand some prepositions, not all of them. Some prepositions are very flexible. Mary comes to Jesus and she falls down where? She falls down before him at his feet. And all English translations are going to say at his feet. Well, the prepositions behind that English translation, 1200 read ace, which means at in this context. 56 read pros, which means at in this context, or toward. 9 read epi, which basically means at. You have a little bit different nuance with para. It means more like beside, but that's only 3 manuscripts. So you can see, even though there's this issue here, they're all going to be translated pretty much the same way. It's not going to impact our understanding at all of what's happened. We know that Mary came. We know where she
Yeah.
fell.
Yeah. And here I go again. I want to insert myself because uh, any theory of the manuscripts, whether it's a textual absolutist one or a textual confidence one or a textual skeptical one, has to give some kind of account for why these
Yep.
variations exist, right? Textual absolutism almost always in my experience, I'm going to have to say always in my experience, I just haven't read
Mhm.
them doing something different. They feed these textual differences into some kind of narrative of
Mhm.
doctrinal change. I've just never
Mhm.
heard them explain, okay, so why does it say at, or by? What about these countless meaningless
Yeah,
differences? Where did they come from? The closest I've ever come to
exactly.
hear an explanation is, well, Satan was trying to cover up his tracks by adding all of this meaningless
Right.
variation along with the stuff that he was doing. And I
Right.
suppose that's, the most plausible explanation anyone could give. But it
Right.
strikes me that there's a reason that they're never giving attention to these matters because they run against their narrative, which is that, change in the manuscripts has to be because of some malign motive, somebody trying to change doctrine.
Yeah. And to speak to that, Mark, there's the issue of Mary and Martha throughout this chapter. I've not talked about that yet at all. That's part of my part B. I'm dealing with the Bart Ehrman argument. Ultimately, I want to get to Elizabeth Schrader in this whole, her whole attack on John 11. I'm not. That's not for tonight. But I'll just say this: Mary and Martha. You have to understand in Greek, they're different by one letter. You have Maria and you have Martha. The iota, theta. That's the only difference between those two names. And so Schrader makes a big deal about the fact that, well, it looks like there's a lot of textual variants where they write Mary and it should have been Martha, or Martha and it should have been Mary. Well, that's true, but my response to that is that they're only different by one letter. You're a copyist and you write mu, alpha, rho, and now you're going to write either a iota or a theta. And it'd be so easy because you're into the story and you forget where you are and you write down the wrong name. If this was a story about Lazarus and Lazarus, two brothers, you would expect all the way through there are going to be mistakes where the names are swapped accidentally. So Lazarus is solid all the way through. There's no mistakes around Lazarus's name. That's one of the names all the way through. There's a couple of misspellings, okay, but no one ever puts in the wrong name, not once. Okay, but it's a story where he's a singular character in the story. There's nothing to confuse him with. So these are just logical. You can predict these things. And as I've like I said, I've looked at now 1,400 manuscripts, and so I start to learn some of the patterns. I've got to the point where I can actually expect this manuscript's going to make this mistake, and they do, because I'm so used to seeing the patterns. These are just it's human limitation. They're making these mistakes because there's these traps that are set up, like the in the resurrection in the last day. That's just a trap. Somebody's going to leave that out because it's there to make that mistake. Other things, you know, Jerusalem is mentioned many times in John 11. Nowhere does somebody put in a different place name for Jerusalem. Nobody says Galilee or some other place name. Jerusalem is always written as Jerusalem because it's unique in the story and doesn't parallel to anything else that could be confused. So anyway, just a little aside there. So coming back to our slide here. Next slide, we have a summary here. What's left? Okay, so we have in John 11, we have 57 verses, a total of 945 words. And again, there are 327 additions, omissions, and substitutions that are each supported by at least a few manuscripts. Okay, but in order to concern us, I have to stress this point again. In order to concern us, these differences would have to, number one, be difficult to resolve. And most of them are not. Most of them are like that 5 manuscripts, 12 manuscript stuff. And the number two, they have to affect the meaning of the text. There's no sense in arguing about an article before a proper name. It's not going to be translated. And so these things both have to be in play to concern us. So as we go to the next slide, this is where we left off, 327. Okay, so here's where I always ask the students in the classroom, how many do you guess we're going to drop to when we take out the things that are easy to explain, don't impact the meaning of the text? How many we're going to have left? And students will say, 40. They'll get one student guesses 120. Another tries to be optimistic and say 12 or 17, that type of thing. So I click the slide and notice what's left. It doesn't even show
Awesome.
any color on the slide. 5. We have 5
Wow.
things that would concern us. Now, the last time I did this, Mark, it was a young lady sitting in the front row, and she looked at me, and she had a look of I never seen anything like it. It was like a look of relief and concern at the same time. I could see what she was thinking. She said,
Yeah.
"This is great, but those 5 still concern me. I'd like to get
Yeah.
to 0." You know, and I could see it in her face. She was a little troubled by it. So let's talk about those 5 real quickly. They're easy to talk through. First of all, confidence. When you read your translation of John 11, you can read with confidence that you are understanding the account as it was penned by the Apostle John. So these five things that are left. Next slide. John 11:19. Okay. You've got many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary. That's option A. Option B, many of the Jews had come to the ones around Martha and Mary. Now, let me ask this question. These Jews came from Jerusalem. Why did they go out there? They went out there to comfort Mary and Martha and the household, right?
After
So
the
does it
death of
really matter?
Lazarus.
Yeah, the death of Lazarus. So does it really matter whether the text says that they came to the ones around Mary and Martha? Because they're going to be ministering to Mary and Martha. We know that. Or just Mary and Martha, knowing that these others are there as well. It's a very slight nuance of difference. This is not something that anybody would lay awake at night worrying about what this text means. Again, this one's hard to resolve. All these five are hard to resolve. Okay, so they're not gimmies. There's good manuscripts on both sides, and here's where the critical text will depart from the majority text and the TR in most of these. So they're a little bit harder to resolve. But again, you understand what John is saying here. You're not left with. Yeah, I didn't mention this earlier, but an example where understanding is effective would be like 1 Thessalonians 2:7. You're familiar with that one, where Paul
Hmm.
says, we were babes among you, or he said, we were gentle among you. Now, those are radically different. Okay, we were babes among you is napioi. We were gentle among you is apioi. The difference is only one letter in the Greek, whether that new is present or absent, and it totally changes the meaning. Now, the good news is we know it's one of those two, but there
Hmm.
is question about the understanding what Paul meant there. We can't have the absolute assurance that we know what Paul meant there, unless you're going to go with the TR, and then whatever that has, you're going to go with that. But but that's an example of understanding being impacted. Okay, so that's not this. This is a nuance. The next verse, John 11:31. These same Jews, they were with her in the house and comforting her. When they saw Mary, rose up quickly and went out, followed her, either saying or thinking she is going to the tomb to weep there. So whether they thought in their minds, oh, yeah, she's going to the tomb, or whether they actually verbalized that, that's the only difference. That's a nuance. That's not really that big of a deal. So,
Yeah.
so this is where I'm starting to give the students confidence that their smiles
Right.
get broader as they go through this. Because now it's like
Good.
I can live with that. That's okay. I can live with this. This is not a big deal. This is okay. Now the next one is a difference between singular and plural, and this one makes sense why this would get into the text. Therefore, many of the Jews, this is after Lazarus has come out, many Jews are going to believe. Why? It says, Jews, they had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did. Well, they either saw the thing or the things. Things is probably original. And later copyists copying this, oh, that's got to be a mistake because Jesus only did what? One thing. He called Lazarus from the tomb. And so they changed it to the singular thing, thinking that I'm fixing the text. But that's really not necessary because Jesus did many things. Even before Lazarus was called from the tomb, he wept, he comforted them, he did many things. So things is probably original, but this is one that's a little bit debated. But again, can you understand what John is saying here?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, this is not at all something to lay awake at night and worry about. Now, this is a fun one. I like this one. This is Caiaphas. He's the high priest. He's trying to give advice to his fellow brethren there in the Sanhedrin. And he says, do you consider it expedient to you that one man should die for the people? That's Haman, the Greek preposition. Or it could be human. Now, the difference between human and Haman in the Greek, those are confused all the time because they
Right.
sound so
All the
similar.
time.
All the time. So we have, do you consider it expedient for us? So the only difference here is whether Caiaphas is including himself in the expediency, or
Right.
or just saying his fellow members of the Sanhedrin, just them and their expediency.
Right.
Not a big deal. I mean, this is very minor stuff,
Right.
and we know it's one or the other. Okay, that's the thing. So John 11:57 on the next slide. This is the final one. This is another one that is just simply plural or singular. The chief priests, the Pharisees, had given orders or given an order that if anyone knew where he was, that he should let them know so they could arrest him. So again, orders was probably the original. Later copyists said, well, why is it orders? Because it's just one order, and so they just change it to the singular. But you know what's going on in the story. There's no confusion here. You're not left wondering what did John mean by this. we have the understanding. We've just lost maybe a little bit of nuance, but we know it's one of two options, singular or plural. And that's it. That's John 11. I've looked at 1,390 manuscripts. On the next slide, 57 verses. There are 3,785 variations. That's true. But once we've gone through these variations and understand them and set aside things that are not impactful, all that chaff is blown away. We have only 5 minor, very minor variations in John
Wow.
11 that prove somewhat difficult to resolve, but none affect the understanding, just a slight nuance. We can understand what John wrote to us. We can have confidence in the text of John 11. And the good news is John 11 is representative of most chapters in the New Testament. We have some famous passages that are hotly debated. Yes, we admit that. Nothing we can do about that. We have the woman caught in adultery. We've got the ending of Mark. We've got a few other verses here and there. But outside of that, most stuff is like John 11. It's just here it is. We can understand we can have confidence in what the author provides for us in written form. This text can be reconstructed. So at this point, Mark, what I do in my classroom is I tell the students, all along this study, I have been. You can advance to the next slide. It's I've been referring to like the experts. The experts have no problem understanding this. The experts have no problem understanding this variation. So I asked the question, well, can we have confidence in these experts, these scholars? Did they do a good job? Did they know what they were talking about? And here's where I kind of transition into the fun part of this presentation. This is where I have this workshop I do with the class. In fact, if you advance a couple more slides here, there's a photograph. I think it's like from 1978 or 9, somewhere in there. You've got Bruce Metzger, Alan Wickgren, Kurt Aland,
Martini.
Carlo Martini, Matthew Black, I think is in there. They're sitting around this table. You look at all the books piled up. They are working on the Greek New Testament right here in this picture. And so I say to my class, this is going to be you for the next half hour. You're these guys. Can you reconstruct a text? So what I do, and I'm just going to summarize this because I know we're short on time, but I just I found a verse in the Gospel of Thomas. Okay, I use the Gospel of Thomas because I don't want anyone in the assignment to happen to have memorized the particular verse in Awanas, and now they're going to spoil the assignment.
Yeah.
So it's something no one's ever been familiar with. Okay, so it's a great verse because it has all the kinds of traps in that verse that lend themselves to variations. So I actually created 9 manuscripts of this verse, and I fill it with all kinds of mistakes. And I clue the students in. I say, okay, this manuscript is dated at this time, but it has the scribe is known for spelling mistakes. This scribe is known for a lot of additions. So I tell them a little bit about what is observable. This is science. You can observe the scribal tendencies and the kinds of mistakes that individual scribes make. And so I give them those clues, and then I break them up into groups of 4, and I turn them loose. I have one person who's like the leader, and the other 3 are policing 3 different manuscripts, and they work as a team, and they go through every last manuscript is defective. None of them are perfect. They all have mistakes. And at this last time I did it, I had almost a perfect score. Overall, now I've had 50 groups go through this workshop. And these are college freshmen, all the way up to like pre-seminary, that kind of a thing. These are not experts. These are not specialists. These are college students. Some of them are actually kind of disinterested, quite frankly. Not really, this isn't their thing. But they're all required to do it because they're in a class. So I have now got a score of 47 out of those 50 groups have perfectly reconstructed that verse from the Gospel of Thomas with all these mistakes.
Wow.
I tell you, the last time this happened, everybody got it right, and this group just cheered. They literally cheered because they realize now they walk out with confidence because we could do this. So arguing lesser to greater, how much more could these guys in this picture do this?
Right.
And so between the presentation on John 11 and the findings there, and then their own experience, they walk out feeling very confident that we don't have to listen to the Bart Ehrmans. We can have confidence in the text. We don't have to be an extreme skeptic. We don't have to listen to their arguments because they've seen real data, and that's what young people are looking for. They want real data. They don't want hypocrisy and all that stuff.
And more pressing for this channel, they don't have to listen to the textual absolutists who say that any textual variation is demonic. That's what they actually say. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them. and
Right.
the refrain, it's understandable why it's so popular for them to repeat this.
Right.
So we got to wrap it up. I got to go to dinner with my kids and got to let you
Yep.
go. This was
Yep.
just utter gold. And frankly, the audio is better on this recording than the one I listened to. So I hope that
Oh,
your
good.
work gets even broader exposure. And I was wondering already about how could we get this second session? How could we do this on YouTube? I don't know yet, but you and I are going to talk about it
Sure.
because you just
Okay.
hit a grand slam. I love this. I want to explain a little bit to people why I love this, and I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up, and then we'll maybe, Lord
Sure.
willing, have another conversation one day.
Sure.
I'm forever trying to get people to look at specifics, to be concrete, and to use sufficient sampling when they come to these, differences among the Greek New Testament manuscripts. And when I made the KJV Parallel Bible that you've seen, and I tried to show in English the differences between the main Textus Receptus edition, which is Scrivener's from
Mhm.
1881, and the main critical text edition, which is the NA 28. Put them all in English, and I tried to get my Textus Receptus friends to work on this with me because the whole point was to be totally neutral, just the facts, ma'am.
Mhm.
I
Sure. Yep.
could I barely scraped together one guy who was willing to contribute to this project. They
Mhm.
just had no interest, or understandably, I get this, no trust in me. What's he doing with this? But I haven't had anyone come along and give credible critiques of it either afterward. I just can't get them interested
Mhm.
because they think they have the solution. I'm going to stick
Mhm.
with this text. I don't have to bother with any of this. In a way, I wish they were right. Again, I say that it's fun for me. I enjoy this sort of thing. You appear to enjoy it even more than I do because you've done way more collating than I have. I did what I was required to do for class. You've done it beyond class. And this is what gave you the ability to give this kind of popularization. But when but when I look at the world God gave us, I have to submit to what He actually did. And it's so helpful to try to organize this massive amount of information. Another reason that people, I think, don't do the sufficient sampling is it's just such a flood of detail. They don't
Mhm.
know how to organize it all.
Right.
And it's so much easier to just say, forget it all. I'm going with this text, no matter what it is. And
Right.
for most people, that's all they actually really need to do. But when you're causing division over this with other Christians, maybe you need to dig into it more. What you've done is you've organized that information for just one chapter of the Bible. Of course, you say this is representative of all the others. I think you're right
Sure.
because I've looked at tons and tons and tons of examples. But those who want to do this work now have a tool. You could go do this. With a
Sure.
little help and a little Greek study, you could go collate yourself. All the information is out there.
Sure.
You can use the categories that Daryl has provided to organize the information and see for yourself. Do these differences actually matter? Even the ones that are difficult
Right.
and have some difference in meaning. How
Sure.
serious are they?
Right.
Do we really have to freak out? Do we really have to divide from other Christians and say that what they're doing is satanic because their Bible says that the Jews went out saying, and ours says they went out thinking? If
Right.
you're going to divide over that, you listen to this verse. I'm going to wag my finger at people out there. These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. And one of them is those who sow discord among brethren. If you're going to
Right.
divide over that,
Right.
then you are sowing discord among brethren. That is sin. I don't always
So,
get that blunt here, but after hearing this excellent presentation, my heart is full, my righteous soul is vexed over people taking these minor things and dividing Christians over it. That shouldn't be happening. Daryl, what you did is excellent. I'm going to look at my notes a little bit. Last thing, unless you have a perfect copy, this is the work you're going to have to do. Just remember, and I honor you, Daryl, for the clear, not just hours, but years of work you put into this. It went by quickly, everybody, but when he said, I've collated this number of manuscripts, and what was the number for John 11?
just about 1,400, just short of
Okay.
1,400.
Just
Yeah.
collating 1,400 manuscripts
Yeah. Yeah.
means reading 1,400 of them and comparing them letter by
Yeah.
letter with
Yeah.
some standard and
I'll just say
listing
if
out
it's
all
a
the
really
differences.
clean, yeah, if it's a clean manuscript, it takes about 30 minutes. If it's very clean. and there's very few variations. So you
And
can understand, yeah, it
that's a
takes a
life.
while.
that- what Daryl just gave you was the distillation in 1 hour of years of labor.
Yep.
You ought to be grateful for that. Is there any way that people, I don't know, do you have an online presence? Can people follow any more of your
I,
work?
I really don't. I don't have a Twitter account. I don't have any way people can
Okay,
follow me or anything. So my nose has been in the research here for years now,
that's,
and so
well,
so
thanks for
you're my
coming
first
out.
exposure.
Thanks for bringing out treasures new and old. And we'll get together here after this and talk about what to make available to everybody and how. And I can make your
Okay,
presentation available to folks, and we'll
that'd
talk
be
about
great.
that second presentation. Thank you
Okay.
so much. I pray that the Lord allows us to have this second conversation, that we figure out a way to do that workshop on YouTube. Let's talk about
Okay.
that. And those of
Sounds
you
good.
who want to say thanks to Daryl, just say it in the comments, and I'll try to keep him alert to any questions that he can answer better than I can. Thank you so much, Daryl. God bless you, brother.
You too. God bless. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.